Either apologize right now or you can leave." The words rang through the dining room with enough force to silence every conversation. Evelyn Harper stood near the end of the table, her arm stretched toward the front door as if she were dismissing an unwelcome stranger instead of her husband's mother. The cheerful atmosphere vanished in an instant. Just moments earlier, laughter had filled the house, while soft music played in the background. The scent of grilled food drifted through the air as family members chatted over lunch. Now every eye was fixed on 70-year-old Margaret Collins, who remained seated with remarkable composure, her fingers wrapped around a glass of sparkling water. The argument had begun over something almost laughably small. After ordering lunch through a delivery app, Evelyn announced that Margaret should clear the table and serve dessert, because according to her, she'd already done enough by organizing the meal. Margaret calmly replied that she had come as a guest to spend time with her family, not to work as the household server. The response bruised Evelyn's pride. Before Margaret could say another word, Evelyn's mother added a cutting remark, claiming that Margaret had always been an impossible mother-in-law who never appreciated anyone else's efforts. Margaret refused to argue. She simply took another sip of water and remained silent. That silence infuriated Evelyn far more than any insult ever could. Across the table sat Margaret's only son, Ryan Collins. He stared at his dinner plate, absent-mindedly moving his fork from one side to the other without taking a bite. Margaret waited for him to speak. She expected him to defend her, or at least ask everyone to calm down. Instead, he lowered his eyes. He said nothing. His silence hurt far more than Evelyn's harsh words. Ever since Ryan married Evelyn 6 years earlier, he had mastered the art of avoiding confrontation. Whenever disagreements arose, he convinced himself that staying quiet was the easiest way to keep peace in the family. To Margaret, however, silence had become another form of betrayal. Evelyn folded her arms and waited confidently. She expected Margaret to apologize, just as she always had in the past. After all, Margaret feared losing precious time with her son and grandchildren. Evelyn believed that fear guaranteed obedience. This time she was wrong. Margaret rose slowly from her chair. She straightened the wrinkles in her cream-colored trousers, picked up her handbag, and looked around the room. No tears, no raised voice, no dramatic speech, only complete calm. "I hope the rest of you enjoy your afternoon," she said politely. Without waiting for a response, she walked toward the front door. Behind her, she heard Evelyn release a satisfied laugh, convinced she had won another battle. She fully expected Margaret to call within a day or two, apologize, and pretend nothing had happened. Margaret closed the front door gently behind her. For the first time in years, she felt something she could hardly describe. Not sadness, not anger, clarity. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Margaret's cozy condominium. She watered the collection of plants lining her kitchen window before brewing a cup of black coffee. Her phone remained silent. No call from Ryan, no message asking whether she had arrived home safely. She wasn't surprised. Most likely, Evelyn had already convinced him that his mother had ruined the family gathering. As Margaret sat at the breakfast counter, she looked honestly at the life she had been living. 5 years earlier, after losing her husband, she had promised herself that she would always help Ryan whenever he needed support. That promise slowly became an endless financial commitment. She had contributed nearly $60,000 toward the down payment on Ryan's beautiful home. Every month, she quietly paid for her grandchildren's expensive private school tuition. She even covered several household expenses whenever unexpected bills appeared. Ryan earned a respectable salary, but he and Evelyn lived well beyond their means. Instead of adjusting their lifestyle, they relied on Margaret's generosity to fill every financial gap. The painful truth settled heavily in her heart. She hadn't been treated like family. She'd been treated like a dependable source of money. Opening her laptop, Margaret ignored the temptation to write an emotional message demanding respect. Instead, she searched her email inbox until she found a message from her longtime friend Helen Brooks, who had recently settled in a peaceful seaside town in Portugal. Months earlier, Helen had written, "The cottage next door is available for rent. It's quiet, beautiful, and exactly the fresh start you deserve. Stop sacrificing your happiness for people who don't appreciate it." At the time, Margaret had dismissed the suggestion. She believed staying close to Ryan was her responsibility. Now the words carried an entirely different meaning. Without allowing herself time to overthink, Margaret reached for her phone and dialed Helen's international number. Helen answered almost immediately. "I've been hoping you'd call," she said warmly. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. "Tell me," she asked softly, "is that little cottage still available?" There was a brief pause. Then Helen laughed. "I had a feeling you'd finally choose yourself." Margaret looked out the window toward the bright morning sky. For the first time in years, she realized her future no longer depended on anyone else's approval. Helen's laughter lingered in Margaret Collins' ears long after the call had ended. For the first time in years, the future felt open instead of frightening. She wasn't running away from her problems. She was walking toward a life she had postponed for far too long. The next morning, Margaret visited the neighborhood bank she had trusted for decades. The branch manager, Daniel Foster, greeted her warmly and invited her into his office. "What can I do for you today, Mrs. Collins?" he asked. Margaret placed her identification on the desk and spoke with quiet confidence. "I'd like to transfer most of the money from my joint account into my personal account. I'd also like to cancel every automatic payment connected to that account." Daniel looked up from his computer with a hint of surprise. "That includes your grandson's school tuition and the monthly lease payment for Ryan's SUV, he said carefully. "Are you certain?" Margaret nodded without hesitation. "I'm completely certain." Within half an hour, everything had been completed. She wasn't taking anyone else's money. Nearly every dollar in that account came from her retirement savings and the pension she had received after her husband's passing. Legally and morally, the money belonged to her. As she stepped outside the bank, the warm sunshine felt strangely comforting. Her phone buzzed. "Ryan," she opened the message. "Mom, Evelyn is still upset about Sunday. She thinks you overreacted. Could you just call her and smooth things over? I hate being stuck in the middle." Margaret read the text twice. Not once had he asked how she was feeling. Not once had he apologized for remaining silent while his wife humiliated her. He simply wanted the argument to disappear so his own life would become easier. Margaret locked her phone without replying. She had more important things to do. Over the next several days, she quietly began dismantling the life she had built over the past 20 years. Furniture she no longer needed was sold to a local antique dealer. Several boxes of clothing were donated to a women's charity. Family photographs, important documents, treasured books, and a handful of keepsakes from her late husband were carefully packed into 3 suitcases. Everything else could stay behind. The more she packed, the lighter she felt. By Thursday afternoon, her condominium looked almost empty. A young married couple from her community book club had been searching for a place to rent nearby. Margaret offered them the furnished apartment at a fair monthly price, and they happily signed a private lease. Instead of sitting empty, her home would now provide steady income while she started her new chapter overseas. Meanwhile, life continued exactly as she expected. Evelyn filled her social media accounts with vague quotes about removing negative people from life and protecting personal boundaries. Margaret smiled each time she happened to see one. Evelyn believed she had won. She had no idea Margaret intended to disappear completely. Ryan called several times over the weekend. Every Sunday, Margaret usually stopped by with homemade pastries for the grandchildren. When she failed to arrive, he finally began to worry. His calls went unanswered. Margaret wasn't trying to punish him. She simply refused to return to a relationship where respect depended entirely on how much money she contributed. Late Sunday evening, she zipped her final suitcase shut and reviewed her travel documents. Flight confirmed. Passport packed. Rental agreement signed. Everything was ready. Early Monday morning, before leaving for the airport, Margaret made one final stop. She took a taxi to Ryan's house. She knew both Ryan and Evelyn would already be gone for work. Using the emergency spare key they had given her years earlier, she quietly unlocked the front door. The house looked exactly as she remembered. Children's toys covered the living room floor. Laundry overflowed from baskets. Dirty dishes crowded the kitchen sink. For years, she would have automatically rolled up her sleeves and started cleaning. This morning, she walked past everything. She entered the kitchen, removed the spare key from her keyring, and placed it carefully in the center of the marble countertop. Beside it, she left a single yellow note. "Here is your key. Take care of yourselves. Margaret." No accusations, no emotional farewell, no explanation. As she turned to leave, her eyes landed on a familiar glass casserole dish sitting inside the pantry. It belonged to her. Weeks earlier, she had brought over homemade baked pasta for the family, and Evelyn had never bothered returning the dish. Margaret smiled softly, slipped it into her canvas bag, and walked toward the front door. When it closed behind her, the sound echoed with quiet finality. She climbed into the waiting taxi. "Airport?" the driver asked. Margaret looked back one last time at the house she had helped make possible. Then she smiled. "Yes," she replied, "and there's no need to hurry." For the first time in years, she wasn't leaving something behind. She was finally moving toward a life that truly belonged to her. The flight to Portugal lasted several hours, but Margaret Collins didn't mind. For the first time in more than a decade, she traveled without worrying about someone else's problems. She leaned back in her seat, read an entire novel, enjoyed a warm meal, and even accepted a complimentary glass of wine. There were no anxious thoughts about paying bills, babysitting grandchildren, or rescuing Ryan and Evelyn from another financial emergency. When the plane finally landed, the morning sun bathed the city in golden light. The red-tiled rooftops stretched toward the sparkling Atlantic Ocean, creating a view that instantly made Margaret feel at peace. Waiting outside the arrivals terminal was Helen Brooks. The two women embraced tightly, laughing as though they had only been apart for a few days instead of several years. "I knew you'd come eventually," Helen said with a smile. "So did you," Margaret replied. A short drive later, they arrived at Margaret's new home. The small stone cottage overlooked the sea, with colorful flowers blooming beneath the windows and a narrow balcony facing the coastline. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it radiated warmth and comfort. Margaret unpacked slowly, placing framed family photographs on the mantel and arranging her favorite books on the shelves. Every corner of the cottage felt peaceful. That evening, Helen took her to a cozy seafood restaurant overlooking the harbor. As fishing boats gently rocked against the docks, the two friends enjoyed fresh grilled fish, warm bread, and local wine. Helen studied Margaret carefully before smiling. "You already look different," Margaret laughed. "I've only been here for a few hours." "I don't mean your clothes," Helen replied. "The tension has disappeared from your face." Margaret gazed toward the ocean. "I think I left more than luggage behind." The next morning, while Margaret wandered through a nearby farmer's market, the calendar quietly reached the third day of the month. Back in the United States, automatic payments were scheduled to leave the joint bank account she had closed days earlier, the private school tuition, the luxury SUV lease, several household expenses. Every payment failed. Margaret didn't need anyone to tell her what would happen next. Late that afternoon, after returning home with fresh fruit and flowers, she finally switched her phone off airplane mode. Within seconds, notifications flooded the screen. 14 missed calls from Ryan, 5 from Evelyn, dozens of text messages. Margaret sat on her balcony overlooking the sea before opening Ryan's messages one by one. The first was confused. "Mom, where are you? I stopped by your condo and another couple is living there. Please call me." The second sounded worried. "The bank rejected the SUV payment. The school says tuition didn't go through. Something is seriously wrong." The third carried frustration. "Evelyn is furious. The cleaning service left because we couldn't pay them. Why would you do this?" The final voicemail was filled with panic. Ryan accused her of abandoning the family without warning. He insisted she had overreacted because of one unpleasant afternoon. According to him, everything could have been solved with a simple conversation. Margaret quietly placed the phone on the table beside her untouched cup of tea. For years, she had solved every financial crisis before anyone else even noticed it. Now they were finally experiencing life without her constant support. She felt no satisfaction watching them struggle. Neither did she feel guilt. Consequences were not revenge. They were simply the natural result of living beyond one's means. Several hours later, as the evening breeze drifted in from the Atlantic, Margaret decided it was time to return Ryan's call. He answered before the first ring had finished. "Mom, where are you?" he demanded. "The bank rejected everything. The school payment bounced, my car payment failed, and Evelyn doesn't understand what's happening." Margaret waited patiently until he stopped talking. Then she answered calmly, "I'm in Portugal." Silence. Ryan spoke again, almost whispering. "Portugal? Yes." "When are you coming home?" "I'm not." Another long silence followed. Ryan sounded completely stunned. "What do you mean you're not coming back? The children could lose their places at school. We need that money." Margaret looked out at the endless blue water stretching toward the horizon. "Ryan," she said gently, "those bills were never mine. They belonged to you and your family. I simply paid them because I loved you. But you've always helped us." "I know," Margaret answered, "and perhaps I helped for too long." Ryan's breathing became heavier. "You can't leave us like this." "I didn't leave you," she replied. "I simply stopped living your life for you." He tried to argue, reminding her that families were supposed to support one another. Margaret interrupted softly. "Support should never become dependence. You're nearly 40 years old. It's time to build a life you can afford without relying on mine." She paused before adding one final sentence. "I left your house key on the kitchen counter. Please don't ask me for money again." With that, Margaret ended the call. She placed her phone aside and watched the sun slowly disappear beneath the ocean horizon. For the first time in many years, she felt something priceless: freedom. Not because she had escaped her family, but because she had finally chosen herself. The weeks that followed settled into a peaceful rhythm Margaret Collins had almost forgotten was possible. Each morning began with a quiet walk along the coastline. The salty breeze carried the scent of the sea as fishing boats drifted across the calm water. Instead of waking to frantic phone calls or endless requests for favors, she spent her mornings sipping coffee on her balcony while listening to the waves. She enrolled in a watercolor painting class, something she had dreamed about for years, but had always postponed because someone else needed her time. On weekends, Helen introduced her to local cafes, open-air markets, and historic villages tucked along Portugal's breathtaking coastline. For the first time since losing her husband, Margaret felt truly alive. Meanwhile, life back in the United States was changing in ways Ryan and Evelyn had never expected. Without Margaret's financial support, they were forced to face the reality they had ignored for years. The luxury SUV was returned after they could no longer keep up with the lease payments. Ryan purchased a reliable used sedan instead. It wasn't glamorous, but it fit their budget. The expensive private academy informed them that the children's enrollment could not continue unless the overdue tuition was paid. Reluctantly, Ryan transferred both children to a nearby public school. To everyone's surprise, the children adjusted quickly. They made new friends, enjoyed their classes, and seemed just as happy as before. The biggest adjustment came at home. Without extra money to hire weekly cleaners, Evelyn found herself doing the housework she had always expected someone else to handle. Laundry piled up. The dishes no longer disappeared overnight. The spotless house she had proudly displayed on social media suddenly required genuine effort to maintain. Arguments became frequent. Several relatives called Margaret after hearing bits and pieces of the story. Some spoke kindly. Others questioned her decision. "Family should always help family," one cousin insisted during a phone call. Margaret answered politely, "I have helped my family for years. Now I'm helping them learn to stand on their own." There was little anyone could say after that. Her boundaries were clear. Months passed peacefully. Whenever guilt tried to creep into her thoughts, Margaret reminded herself of that Sunday afternoon. She remembered Evelyn pointing toward the front door. She remembered Ryan lowering his eyes instead of defending her. Most of all, she remembered how invisible she had felt in the very home she had helped pay for. Those memories strengthened her resolve. Instead of financing someone else's lifestyle, Margaret began investing in herself. She took a scenic train journey through the countryside. She bought a warm wool coat she had admired for months. She attended concerts in small seaside towns and explored museums she had always wanted to visit. Every purchase reminded her of something important. Her money represented decades of hard work shared with her late husband. It deserved to improve her own life, not support people who viewed her generosity as an obligation. Nearly 6 months after arriving in Portugal, Margaret's phone rang one quiet afternoon. Ryan, she hesitated before answering. His voice sounded different. There was no anger, no frustration, only exhaustion. After exchanging a few minutes of casual conversation about the weather and Margaret's new home, Ryan finally spoke from the heart. "Mom, I owe you an apology." Margaret remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I should have defended you that day. I should have stopped Evelyn before things went that far. Instead, I stayed quiet because I thought avoiding conflict would keep everyone happy." He paused. It didn't. Margaret closed her eyes. Listening was easier than speaking. Ryan continued. "I also took everything you did for us for granted. I never realized how much we depended on you until you were gone. These past months have been difficult, but they've taught me lessons I should have learned years ago." A gentle smile appeared on Margaret's face. It wasn't the apology she had expected. It was better. It sounded sincere. "I appreciate you saying that," she replied softly. There was another brief silence. Then Ryan spoke again. "The children miss you every day. I miss them too. We were hoping," Ryan said carefully, "that maybe we could visit you this summer." Margaret looked through her window at the sparkling blue ocean. She wanted to see her grandchildren more than anything. "I'd love that," she answered warmly. "There's a wonderful family resort only a few streets from my cottage. I'll send you the details so you can reserve a room." Ryan hesitated. "There is one more thing." Margaret already knew what he was about to ask. "Can Evelyn come too?" Margaret took a slow breath before answering. "Not yet." Her voice remained calm. "There are some wounds that need more time to heal. I'm happy to welcome you and the children, but I'm not ready to share my home with Evelyn." Ryan sighed quietly. This time he didn't argue. "I understand." After saying goodbye, Margaret placed her phone on the table and stepped onto her balcony. The ocean stretched endlessly before her. For the first time in many years, she understood that forgiveness and boundaries could exist together. She wished her son happiness, but she would never again sacrifice her own peace to create it. Summer arrived with bright skies, warm sunshine, and a gentle ocean breeze that drifted through Margaret Collins' little cottage every morning. The flowers on her balcony were in full bloom, and the sound of seagulls had become as familiar as the ticking of the clock in her living room. Life had settled into a peaceful routine. Every day reminded her that choosing herself had not been selfish, it had been necessary. One afternoon, an email appeared in her inbox from Ryan. Attached were the flight confirmations and hotel reservation for him and the children. As promised, they had booked rooms at the family resort a few blocks away instead of expecting to stay in Margaret's home. She smiled. For the first time in years, Ryan wasn't asking for a favor. He was respecting a boundary. A week later, Margaret stood outside the resort entrance waiting for them to arrive. The moment the children spotted her, they raced across the courtyard with joyful laughter. "Grandma!" Margaret opened her arms wide, tears filling her eyes as she hugged them tightly. "I've missed you both so much." "So have we," they answered together. Ryan approached more slowly, carrying their luggage. For a brief moment, mother and son simply looked at one another. Neither of them needed grand speeches. Ryan stepped forward and embraced her. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. Margaret returned the hug. "I know." During the following week, they explored Portugal together. They wandered through colorful streets lined with historic buildings. They sampled fresh pastries from neighborhood bakeries. The children chased pigeons through old town squares, collected seashells along the beach, and begged Margaret to teach them how to paint watercolor sunsets. Each evening, Ryan walked his children back to the resort before returning to his room. Not once did he ask to stay at Margaret's cottage. Not once did he question the boundaries she had established. That quiet respect meant more than any apology ever could. One evening, while watching the sunset from a seaside cafe, Ryan finally spoke openly about the months after Margaret had left. "It was harder than I expected," he admitted. "I imagine it was." "I blamed you at first," Margaret nodded. "I know. But eventually I realized I wasn't angry because you stopped helping us. I was angry because I had built my life around expecting you to." Margaret remained silent. Ryan continued. "I never noticed how dependent we'd become. Every financial problem had one solution: you. Every emergency had one answer: you. I convinced myself that was normal. It wasn't," Margaret said gently. "I understand that now." He looked toward the ocean before speaking again. "Evelyn and I have changed a lot." Margaret listened quietly. "We sold things we couldn't afford. We created a budget. I started saving money instead of spending it. The kids are doing well in their new school. And," he added with a faint smile, "I've learned how to clean a bathroom." Margaret couldn't help laughing. "I'm proud of you." Ryan smiled for the first time that evening. "Those words mean more than you know." As the visit came to an end, the children hugged Margaret tightly before leaving for the airport. "Promise you'll come back next year." "I promise," Margaret replied. After they left, the cottage became quiet once more. Margaret stood alone on her balcony, watching the waves roll gently onto the shore. She reflected on everything that had happened during the past year. If Evelyn had never demanded that she leave the house, if Ryan had defended her that afternoon, if she had continued apologizing simply to keep the peace, she would still be living the same exhausting life. Instead, one painful moment had changed everything. She had discovered that respect cannot be purchased with money, love cannot survive without dignity, and peace is worth protecting at any cost. Margaret realized she no longer carried anger toward Evelyn. Forgiveness had slowly replaced bitterness, but forgiveness did not require forgetting, nor did it require reopening the door to someone who had never accepted responsibility for the pain they caused. Some relationships could heal only from a distance. That was enough. As the sun disappeared beneath the Atlantic horizon, Margaret smiled. For years she had believed her purpose was to solve everyone else's problems. Now she understood something far more important. Her purpose was to live her own life with courage, kindness, and self-respect. The greatest lesson she had learned was simple. Respect is never won through arguments, sacrifices, or endless generosity. It begins the moment you value yourself enough to walk away from those who repeatedly take you for granted. Helping the people you love is a beautiful act. Allowing them to depend on your kindness while denying you basic respect is not. Sometimes the bravest decision is not to fight harder for a place in someone else's life. Sometimes true freedom begins when you quietly close one door, walk toward another, and never look back. Standing on her balcony with the endless ocean before her, Margaret finally understood that happiness had never been waiting in someone else's approval. It had been waiting for her to choose herself all along, and with that choice, she gained something no amount of money could ever buy. She gained peace.